Thanks for joining us. My name is Jessie Wilder, and I am the Program Committee Chair for Venice Area Audubon. And I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, especially our friends at West Volusia Audubon. Welcome to y'all. We've got a great program tonight, and I'm excited about hearing John Dunn talk about his book. Just for a brief introduction, John is a freelance writer, an author, and an educator, and he's written more than 400 articles for various publications such as Florida Trend, Business Florida, Europe, Sierra, and the St. Pete Times. He's authored 16 nonfiction young adult books, some of which have received national recognition, and he's edited a Civil War series for young readers. In February of 2020, his book, Drying Up: The Freshwater Crisis in Florida, was selected as the winner of the Florida Historical Society's Stetson Kennedy Award for writing about Florida's natural environment. The book has also won the Bronze Medal for Florida Nonfiction in the 2019 Florida Book Awards. John is a father and a grandfather, and he lives with his wife in Ocala, Florida. So let's welcome John Dunn. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here tonight. The purpose of my presentation and the book is to provide particularly somebody new to the state with an overview of Florida's water problems and solutions, and a call to action for all of us to do something about it. So here we go. I'm going to show you a lot of slides and try to move them every 30 seconds or so to keep the show moving. I need to get this down though. Okay, that's better. Sorry about that. Okay, so I first started writing about water in 1997 when I was doing a lot of magazine work for several publications, and I had an opportunity to write the cover article for the international edition of the Rotarian to talk about what was then a emerging global problem. 80 countries at the time were facing future water shortages. But since then, things have not gotten any better. Water use has grown at twice the rate of population increase in the last century. And the United Nations estimates that more than 2 billion people lack access to safe drinking water, and that number is expected to increase in the coming decades. Here is an aerial view of the Earth. This is done by the Jet Propulsion Lab, and what we see here are 37 depictions of aquifers around the world. And anything that's not blue or green is bad news. That means that from varying amounts, with down here, red is the worst. It means that humans are extracting water from the ground faster than nature is replenishing those water sources. And if you can see, even though we are in a very wet state, and so is the Gulf Coast, we are in one of these areas that's close to becoming a tipping point. Here's another way of looking at it. This map was put together a couple of years ago, actually, using data from the Florida's 5 water management districts and the Department of Environmental Protection, or the DEP. And as you can see, Central Florida and South Florida have already passed that tipping point. And we have a population increase that's coming, and all expectations are that things will probably become even more demanding on our water supply. So how could this be? I'm sure a lot of you have heard about water shortages in the Mideast or for the states along the Colorado River in California. How could it be that Florida, one of the wettest states, could be called a state that's drying up? And look at this, 55 trillion gallons of year fall on the state, and we only use 1 trillion, yet we appear to be running out of water. So how could that be? Well, for one thing, we are squandering a lot of it, and we are also getting more and more people all the time, and more businesses, and more economic enterprises, and all sorts of things. And so people in the water business talk about a well in terms of straws. So we keep putting more straws in the ground, pulling water up out of the ground. One thing I'd like to make clear here is that unlike many other states, here in Florida, we don't usually use surface water for our drinking water. We pump water out of the ground for the most part. And even though that's starting to change, there are some indications that what we've been doing is very harmful. I live in Ocala in the north central part of the state, and from here up to the Georgia border, there's over 1,000 natural springs, including what used to be the emperor of all the springs, Silver Springs. But about 1/3 of all those springs, or 393 of them, have shown a decline of pumping power. The amount of water that comes up out of the ground has decreased about 32% on average for all those springs. Silver Springs, at times during the year, loses about 30 to 40% of the water volume that comes up. And it's sadly the case that it is no longer a first magnitude spring. The reason? People are just extracting too much water out of the ground. Sometimes the impact is very dramatic, as you can see here at White Springs in the Swanee River. This is was called a bathhouse, and people would come from all over the world to luxuriate in the spring waters here. And this is how it appeared in 1914. But by 2005, White Springs was gone. And the main culprit was a nearby phosphate mining operation that just kept pumping water out of the ground to meet its needs until the spring was gone, and so are the people. But it's not just pumping. Our Florida water infrastructure is also leaky and wasteful. Some of our pipes are anywhere from 75 to 100 years old. Every year, the Society of American Architects puts out an infrastructure report card, and our freshwater infrastructure and our wastewater or stormwater infrastructure, they all are given about a D or D- year after year. It's also true that too much of our water is just simply wasted. In Florida, we take the available public supply water that we are given by the water management districts to use for swimming pools and watering our lawns and drinking and taking baths and so forth. Well, out of that, we use over 50% every single day to water our lawns. So in one sense, you could say Florida's chief crop, number one crop, is lawns, St. Augustine grass. It's not just that, and it might come as a surprise to some of you that are new to Florida, but we do get droughts here occasionally. And in fact, in the 1970s, the drought was so severe that it led to many of the water and environmental laws that are on the state books today. We also have a lot of pollution. It comes in all types. And as you know, if you've been watching the news lately, we're having fish kills and manatee kills, and it seems to be relentless. And it's because of a variety of reasons. We have all kinds of pollutants. Some are bacteria, some are nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus that come from human activities and natural causes. But we also have a whole cocktail of industrial chemicals in this state: arsenic, cyanide, mercury, nickel, lead, and so forth. As a result, Florida has over 1,700 impaired water bodies. This is a map that shows Superfund sites. A Superfund is a major pollution dump that industry has abandoned and left to the taxpayers to clean up. Sometimes I ask my environmental friends how many do they think are in Florida, and time after time they'll say, "What? This is Florida. We don't have those problems. This isn't Gary, Indiana, or Cleveland or Chicago or someplace." But the answer is we have something like 95 of these, and they, as we speak right now, they are polluting, and the pollutants are seeping down in the ground and poisoning our water supplies. We seem to be adding new sites that maybe can be designated as a federal Superfund. One maybe is the Piney Point problem that a lot of you have to contend with on the Gulf Coast there, where a site that was holding contaminated wastewater was by necessity pumped in the Gulf of Mexico, and now is causing all kinds of aquatic problems and pollution of a variety of marine life. One of the biggest problems we have is stormwater. A lot of people think stormwater is just rainwater, but it's not just rainwater. When that rain falls down and hits the earth and washes over farms and roadways and construction sites and dumps and so forth. It picks up a whole cocktail, an abundance of pollutants of all sorts. And then what happens is it comes into a stormwater retention area in Florida. And most of it is not treated. It will just be sent into a ocean or a wetland or an estuary somewhere, and does a lot of damage at the receiving end. Wastewater is water that's supposed to be treated. That's water that's been used by humans for anything from farming to factory, industrial use to domestic flushing, so to speak. And we have something like 4,000 wastewater treatment plants in the state. But even then, they are not bound by law to demand the removal of all kinds of pollutants. Pharmaceuticals, for example, with the birth control ingredients and Viagra, and other chemicals like that can stay in the water. There's no federal requirement that they be removed. And you don't even have to clean the water totally in some places. For many years, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties have been sending their treated wastewater out into the Atlantic Ocean. The EPA said they have to stop by 2025, but so far they are still doing this. It's been treated, but that's not clean enough. I guess it's an improvement over when I was a boy growing up in South Florida, when they used to just take raw sewage and dump it in the ocean. Even when wastewater is treated, there's a problem with the stuff that's left over. So that's what you see here. It's called a biosolid. If you don't like it, you call it nasty sludge. You try to find a good purpose for it, you call it fertilizer. And something like 75% of all this stuff that's extracted from wastewater at the treatment plants can be used and has been used as fertilizer. The problem is if the farmers overdo it and their plants can't absorb all this stuff, the excess seeps down into the ground and pollutes the groundwater again. One of the problems in Florida is that farmers who cause a lot of pollution to the natural world are on the honor system. Here's an example of what I mean. This is a self-evaluation form that agriculture fills out, and they evaluate whether they are complying with best management practices to clean up the pollution that they're causing. And they can put, yes, I've complied, or no, I haven't. And for the most part, there's no police action that comes. When I say police action, I mean enforcement from the Department of Agriculture or anybody else in the state. Septic tanks are the fastest growing provider of nitrogen in Florida. And nitrogen is one of those nutrients that causes algae to it grow so abundantly in Florida and do so much damage. One of the problems is with septic tanks is that except for the day they're put into the ground, they're never inspected by anybody. So if you have a leaky septic tank, as we do all across the state, that fecal juice that gets out and on the loose sometimes can make its way, meander to a fresh water supply. And for a variety of reasons, which I'll show you in a few minutes, this problem is becoming more severe every day. Even when people abandon, or not abandon, but they get off septic tanks and hook to a sewer line, that's not always a panacea, because in Florida, many of our sewage systems are leaking and they're backing up and polluting freshwater sources. In fact, here is a study, and this is a couple of years old, so if anything, these numbers are too low. Since 2009, there have been 23,000 sewage spills in Florida, with enough untreated sewage to fill 2,400 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And the nutrients that come from that and fertilizer and other sources is fueling algae outbreaks all over the state and around the world, actually. So here's what it looks like at Kings Bay on Crystal River over at Levy County much of the year. This is what it looks like underwater in one of our springs. This one happens to be Heart Spring, but it could be any number of springs. When the algae grows, it smothers the natural aquatic life. It shades out other forms of life, and it's just a massive killer of the natural world that was once there. When I was a boy growing up in South Florida in the 50s, we'd hear about red tide, which is a natural occurring phenomena. There's a microorganism that causes it, which is similar to the algae, or it is a form of algae, but it seemed like it was always in the southwestern part of the Gulf Coast, and it came just once or twice a year. But now we have red tide outbreaks all around the state, periodically during any given year. And for the most part, scientists think it's the outflow to the coast of phosphorus and nitrogen. We also have a problem with rising seas in Florida. Florida is ground zero of the climate crisis. If you read the literature about climate change and how Florida fits into the story, the government, federal government, and its scientists say the state that's most imperiled is Florida. I think most of us can understand that sea level rise means that water is coming in at the beaches and working its way inland. But there's more to the story. As you can see on that illustration there, Florida sits on top of salt water. It's not just the case that we have salt water at the beaches, there's salt water underneath the state as well. As the sea level rises, it pushes on the brackish water. The brackish water pushes upward on the fresh water in here, and this water rises to the top. As it does, several things happen. Any drain fields from septic tanks are now going to be infiltrated by fresh water, and that fresh water will be contaminated. Also, as the groundwater rises, because it's being pushed up this way, when it rains, there is less earth to absorb that rain. And then that rain is going to not infiltrate as much and become stormwater and become polluted and then just wash out to sea. So as you can see, our freshwater supply in multiple ways is being threatened by sea level rise. What this one depicts is the biggest problem of them all. I interviewed a lot of scientists for this project, and many of them would say something like this: okay, John, you've heard all the problems I've just described for you that account for our diminishing water supply, but I haven't got to the biggest one yet. You haven't? I said, no. The biggest problem that we have in Florida and the world is the relentless destruction of the natural hydrology. That means the destruction or the hindering of the natural water cycle, or the disruption of it, in the name of progress. Here is a field or a forest. It once was a forest, and it's really sad those trees have been chopped down in Palm Beach County. But the thing I want to emphasize here is that all these trees used to be reservoirs of water. Water was stored in these trees. Water was stored in the plants. When it rained, the water would seep down into the earth underneath. It didn't run off because the roots and the grass and the plant life below would keep the water from running away. And then the trees would, through evaporation, would put it back in the air, and then eventually would rain, and the water cycle goes over and over, like we all learned in 4th grade. But when bulldozers come and chop all this down, now you don't have those things anymore. And when it rains, the water often just runs off in a contaminated form and goes to a stormwater retention area somewhere. And here is an example of things gone wrong. In Miami, where I'm from, we have a lot of examples of hydrological disasters. So just think about this. When it rains and the rain comes down, it hits all this concrete and asphalt and eventually goes into this canal. And the purpose of this canal is to send that water out to Biscayne Bay and get rid of it. Now it is fresh water, and that's one of the tragedies, that we're transporting our fresh water out into the ocean just to get rid of it because we don't know what to do with it. At the same time, we're running out of fresh drinking water. A problem, though, is at the end here where it hits the Biscayne Bay, which is connected to the Atlantic Ocean, because of sea level rise, a lot of these canals, and there's hundreds of them down in South Florida, we're getting to the point where a lot of this water cannot be evacuated anymore because they are dependent on gravity, and the ocean is higher than the canal at the exit point. So increasingly, we're going to see these canals back up and flood into all these neighborhoods. In addition, with all this concrete and the water just can't seep down into the ground, we have an 80% loss of deep infiltration and a 25% loss in evapotranspiration. Here is Jacksonville. Things look pretty bleak there. It's hard to find any green at all. So you can just imagine the stormwater runoff problems when it rains here. To show you what happens in Florida in so many places, I chose sort of a negative poster child, Marco Island. I used to go here as a boy and to camp and fish. My family and I would get in a car and we come across the Everglades and come to the South Coast. This is a little bit below Venice. And this is what it looked like in the 1960s. It really was a wilderness island. By the middle of the 60s, though, the developers had come in and dramatically altered it. Excuse me just a second, I need to shut the door. Here, I'm sorry, she threw me.
Yeah, you can just go.
Here is an aerial slide of Marco Island. In the 1960s, well, in the 50s, my family and I in Miami would get in a car, drive across the Everglades on the Tamiami Trail and come to the Gulf Coast and go to this wilderness island. I camped here with the Boy Scouts in the early 60s, and it was just a wonderful place to go. However, by the mid 1960s, real fast, just within a couple of years, everything was mowed down and replaced with this kind of development, which is called finger development. The whole idea was to create communities where everybody could have a boat in their backyard and pretend like they were rich and had yachts or something. So Marco Island was just transfigured at best, or massacred at worst, to look like this. And today, this is what Marco Island looks like. So that kind of transformation took place all over the state. I guess it really started going crazy in the 1920s and it's still going on today. Near where I live is one of the fastest growing areas in the United States. It's called the Villages. It's a retirement complex. It's in 3 counties and it's over 100,000 people, and it's going every day. More and more homes, look-alike dwellings on land that used to be wetlands, farmland, forest, water recharge areas, and animal habitat. So we have a problem with growth in Florida. We have a net growth of anywhere from 865 to 1,000 people each and every single day. If you do the math in a year's time, that represents a population that equals to that of Orlando, appearing every single year in Florida. Well, that brings me to mentioning a very important water report that came out in 2017. So far, it's still the most important study that's been done concerning the anticipated population growth for Florida in the next few decades and demand on our water supply. So here are a few takeaways. Florida's population could increase 75% by 2070, which means another 15 million people are probably coming, with a 53.7% increase in demand for water. But let me give you some perspective what all that means. When I was born in 1949, there were roughly 2 million people in the state. Now there are 22 to 23 million people in the state. So we're talking about an enormous growth. And here's something the study did not even look at. In 2019, Florida attracted a record 131.4 million visitors in 1 year. That was about double what it had been 10 years before. And there are agencies in the state government and private companies that are encouraging more and more population growth, more and more tourism. They don't say where the water's coming from. All they can think of are the profits to be made off of development. Here's what Florida looks like from outer space. This is a NASA photo. The lighted areas, of course, this is nighttime, show you where the people are living. But don't think that this won't be developed. This is the Everglades. It might be safe, but maybe even this won't be safe either, because if some scientists are correct, 100 years from now, this could be swamped by the ocean at least half of the year. But developers and their compliant governments, local and state, have big plans to fill in these dark areas with new development. And there's too many to mention right now, so I'll just pick one. And I'll refer to Miami because I'm from there originally, and I can make fun of my home city, I think, with impunity. But anyway, the Miami-Dade County government has already approved this project, and they haven't started laying blocks or concrete yet, but the permitting process is underway. And it is called the American Dream. It's been proved for built out right along the Everglades, the endangered Everglades. It is a $4 billion retail and entertainment complex, and it will have snow. Plans call for a big glass dome to be built over the project, and to let people who are going to get tired of buying shoes or eating popcorn to come out here and ski. This in a subtropical climate in Miami, where they're facing freshwater shortages, and they are facing sea level rise. They're going to use their water supply for this. A lot of the drama and trauma that I was just referring to in that case is how to solve those problems and have enough water for the future, enough for humans, enough for nature, and so forth. The people who make those decisions are on the water management boards of 5 water management districts in Florida. And if you get into the game or the effort to try to do something about your local waterway, you need to know how these water management districts work. And I tried to explain that in the book. Florida is unique in the country because we don't have a central water agency. We have basically 5 principalities, and depends on where you live, what kind of battle you'll have to fight and who's going to be on that board and so forth. Each of those have their own histories. When you go to those meetings, very often you'll hear people who are in the development business take the microphone and go to the podium and say, well, I'm in favor of this new project, and it's going to bring a lot of jobs, a lot of economic benefits to the area. And then when the question arises, what are you going to do for the water? Well, they always say, well, the answer is, let's just grow the water pie. How do you grow a water pie? What is a water pie? Well, a water pie is just a pie chart that shows the allocation to the different economic sectors of the freshwater, total amount of fresh water that's available in the state. You and I, what we get in our house is part of the public supply. It represents 35% of all the water. Agriculture gets the biggest share in Florida. And I want to point out this one. Electricity commands about 10%. But you know what? Nationwide, this number becomes 40%. And increasingly, as we turn more towards electricity for our power needs, we are going to be using more water, because in order to make electricity, no matter what kind of fuel you use to heat up the system, you have to turn water into steam to turn the turbines to make electricity. By the way, the biggest sector worldwide is agriculture. I think it's like 75% of the water in the world is used to grow food for people. So as the water becomes less abundant in the future and the population of the world keeps increasing, you can see the problem there. There's a lot of talk often when anybody's bringing up the water woes of Florida or the United States or the world, and eventually somebody will say, well, and they're right, they'll say a lot of people in the military and intelligence agencies say that water is the next oil, that we'll have water wars. Well, if you study the literature, there have been water wars in the past, and we've already had them in Florida. Here in Pasco and Pinellas and Hillsborough County, starting in the 70s, they didn't fight and shoot each other, but they went to court and had these really terrific battles over how to share a common water supply. But we also have problems with other states. There's an ongoing problem that involves Alabama, Georgia, and Florida over 2 water basins. That water is flowing south, and Alabama and Florida fear that Georgia uses too much and doesn't leave enough for the rest of us downstream. And this has gone to the US Supreme Court a couple of times, and the story is very complicated. But right now, just say the last time it went to the Supreme Court, Florida did not do well. There's an ongoing water war not far from where I live, up in Putnam County, which is, I guess, the northeastern part of the state. And very simply put for right now is this: back in the started in the 1930s, there was a US federal project that got started, which would, if it had ever been built out, would have built something similar to the Panama Canal that would allow ships to sail right through the heart of the state, sort of roughly north of Tampa, end up near Jacksonville. Well, eventually the project was stopped, and it was stopped by Richard Nixon actually in the 1970s. And today, most people consider it a boondoggle, and it never should have started, but it did. But it was stopped before it could really tear the state in half. The problem is there was some construction, and one of the things that was built was a dam on the Ocala River. It serves absolutely no purpose because there is no barge canal, as it was later called. So there's the environmental community wants this to come down to allow a natural flowing river to be like it once was. On the other side are people that have grown accustomed to bass fishing in the reservoir that the dam provides, and they want it to stay up for recreational purposes. In the meanwhile, it is a deteriorating edifice, and there's a lot of legal action that is part of this story as well. The biggest water war, I think, in Florida, which I will not try to get into right now, but I try to summarize it in one chapter in my book, is what to do about Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades. We have new threats to our water supply this happened not too far from where some of you live. In February of 2021, hackers tried to poison the drinking water at Oldsmar by manipulating computers. They didn't get away with it, but it put a great fear into water management officials and utility around the state. So having said all that, it's all pretty depressing so far. So now I'm going to try to pivot towards something a little bit more optimistic. So what do we do about all these problems? Do we just stay with what's called the demand-driven, hard-engineered hard path? That's what the Army Corps of Engineers does. It's made up of engineers, and they build things out of concrete. They dig holes, they make dams, they make aqueducts, they make canals. If you need water 50 miles away, well, they'll divert it for you. And if you want wastewater out of there, to build another conduit and evacuate it and bring in the fresh water in one pipe and get rid of it in a second pipe. Well, is that the best way? Well, certainly we have to continue with this engineering, demand-driven, hard way of doing things for a while, but there is an emerging second path, which I'll get to in just a second. Some of the hard path approaches call for using more desalination, like city of Tampa does. That means using new technology to convert brackish or even salt water into fresh water. And a lot of times you'll hear people, especially new to Florida, who say, I don't understand why this is a problem. There's the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf, just go out there, boil the water, and you've got plenty of fresh water. Don't the Israelis do that? Well, it's not that simple. By the way, we have dozens and dozens and dozens of these desal plants around the state, but this is the biggest one. And until recently, California now has a distinction. This used to be the biggest one in the United States until about a year and a half ago. And I took the tour here, and it's an amazing place. They do convert brackish water in the Tampa Bay area into drinking water for the people, but it only provides about a third of the water, not all of it. And it's only in operation part of the year. It's energy intensive. It was expensive to build, and there's problems with destruction of marine life, and then some problems with what do you do with the salt or the brine that's left over. Hard path advocates also say, well, let's look for new water supplies. It's sort of like saying, let's go find a new gold deposit and dig it up. Well, water is finite, and it's not easy to find new deposits, but sometimes it does happen. But more than a year ago, satellites indicated to the scientists that there just very well may be a huge glacial deposit of fresh water underneath the sand on the ocean floor off of these states here. And perhaps one day that water could be pumped up and meet the needs of the people who live here. But as some of you may already know, off the coast of Florida, there are freshwater springs that bubble up, and the state government is making an inventory of them. They know they're out there. In fact, there are stories from the 18th and 19th century of ships that would supposedly anchor out off the coast of Florida near these springs, throw buckets overboard, and it was so abundant and so forth that you could just drink it right there in the ocean. Well, it's still there, and it could be piped into the mainland of Florida. But the scientists I spoke to said it's just not practical, and it's very, very expensive to do that. And they're also not sure if those springs out in the ocean and in the Gulf might still be part of the aquifer system that's on land. Well, there's movement in the state of Florida to not just rely on groundwater, but to start tapping our rivers. There are powerful groups in the Orlando area who've put pressure on the water management districts to set in motion a project that would lower the St. Johns River to meet the water needs of the people in Orlando. Back in the early 1990s, there was a controversial project that was put forward by the Council of 100 in the Tampa Bay area, which was basically powerful business people, who suggested that the state pipe water from the water-rich North Florida down to Central and South Florida, where all the people are. Well, the people in North Florida pitched such a fit that the politicians backed off and shelved the project. But it's still there, and it's still a possibility one day to have huge pipes send the water around the state. Another proposal is, excuse me, to build more reservoirs in the state. Georgia has a lot of these. The trouble with building a reservoir, though, is Florida's so flat, it's hard to find a cavity that's big enough to hold a lot of water. And there's also evaporation problems. But still, this is a big one. I think it may be the biggest one in Florida. And it's an appropriately named remote area in the state called Fort Lonesome. And it supplies Atlanta with another third of its water. I went out there for a tour to get information for my book, and the engineer that drove me around told me that it's so big that it takes 2 men on lawnmowers 2 weeks to cut the grass. It's 1 mile this way and 2 miles that way. Increasingly, we're using digital technology to try to micromanage water usage to make sure it's done more efficiently. There there's simple technology that we can use in the hard path area. A friend of ours got back from Japan recently and showed us a picture of a typical commode in Japan. You do what you have to on the toilet here, and then when you wash your hands, that gray water is used to flush the toilet. So you're not you're not using fresh drinkable water to flush the toilet. And I think they do that with their showers as well in some places. Now we get to a more optimistic look. This idea is often called the soft path, and people around the world are talking about it. Oops, I'm sorry. It's called more often the low impact approach in Florida. And the philosophical underpinnings are very different. The starting points for this approach to water management are provide the water we need, not the water we want, to sustain ecological and sociological health. How do you go about it? You minimize damage that you do to the environment when you have a project. You try to conserve what you can. You try to restore what's been damaged, particularly that hydrologic system I was talking about before. And when you try to restore that, you use bulldozers and so forth to move around the land or to build tunnels underneath the ground to try to mimic the natural hydrologic systems that were there before all those developers started showing up in the 1920s. It's built on this idea too. All water is one water. I have spoken to this one mayor of a town on the Atlantic coast, and he told me that he and the city council a couple of years ago were wondering how they're going to have enough water for the future population that was headed their way based on all these studies, and they just didn't know where it was going to come from. And he said that same day he was walking and he was looking at a canal, and the canal was evacuating all this stormwater that hit the city. And he realized that every week we send billions and billions of gallons out to sea. That's crazy. We need fresh water. We have fresh water. It's dirty, but we're sending it out to sea. So now they and other communities have begun this new approach, which is to not send that water away, but to contain it in your local community and then try to use natural systems to cleanse it, to recycle it. Now, Florida already leads the nation in the use of recycled or reuse water. You might be thinking, does this mean we're going to be recycling our toilet water? The answer is maybe. Just 6 months ago, the Department of Environmental Protection put out a press release saying that this is coming. We need to work for it. It's a great idea to enhance our drinking water supply. We ought to be thinking about recycling our wastewater. I don't think, and it means that you're going to see water go directly from your toilet to some treatment center, and then it's going to be bottled right there. There are other ways to do it, lots of them. But even in a case like that, it would be treated to the highest level and then mixed with other existing fresh water. What Tampa wanted to do, but political pressure made them stop for a while, is they wanted to take treated sewage water, which they are now dumping into Tampa Bay. And instead of dumping into Tampa Bay, they want to pipe it down into the ground. And the idea is, as it goes through the earth, it will be cleansed, and then we'll get into the deep aquifer, and over decades and decades and decades, it'll eventually work its way through pressure back up to the surface and will be cleaned of contaminants. Another way is to change how we price water. And that a lot of times the more you use, it's called economy of scale, the more you use, the cheaper it is per unit. Well, maybe with water and other precious resources, it should be just the other way around. And some Florida cities are doing this. And the idea is, and it might be true where you live, I don't know, but everybody pays kind of a low rate for water for the first 3,000 gallons, which might be the necessary level for survival. But once you start using more than what's necessary, then you start paying more per unit, like per gallon, the price goes up. And the idea is to encourage people to conserve. We see increasingly the use of what's called green infrastructure in Tampa and other places to treat stormwater, which in the old days would just hit the pavement, go down a drain somewhere. But now it's going through all this vegetation and gravel, trying to clean it of some of the street pollutants. Mimicking nature, it can be seen in a big way in Orlando's artificial wetland park. This is the biggest one in the world, and it might be the most famous. Very, very briefly put, but 20 years ago or so, Orlando faced a problem. It was treating its wastewater in a wastewater treatment center, and it was then piping it into the St. Johns River. But then the DEP said, oh, that's not good enough. That water is still not clean enough to put into the river. You're going to have to come up with a new method. So what to do? Should we get another expensive wastewater treatment plant? Well, the scientists, there was a new idea around, and the scientists eventually convinced the commissioners to give it a go. And what it turned out to be was they took an old farm field and they planted thousands and thousands of trees and plants that were all handpicked to put a final, as they said, polishing on the already treated wastewater. But the wastewater is pumped into this artificial wetland, and then these plants absorb nutrients and other pollutants, and they go, and it's a slow movement of water until it gets over to the St. Johns River. And I've been told by the people in charge of the project that as far as the DEP is concerned, this water is actually now cleaner than the St. Johns River when it reaches it. Today, there's over 50, 60 to 70 of these around the state somewhere. Where I live in Ocala, we opened up one last year, and it takes it takes treated wastewater and treated stormwater, both of those, and puts it through a process like this. And then it's allowed, instead of sending it out to a river, it's allowed to seep down into the earth and get back to the aquifer. So this is part of that soft path. Winter Haven should get a trophy for what it's been doing. This is a success, it's a major success story, and I mentioned in the book, and I've been talking a long time, so I don't want to go into the details of it right now, but they have decided to meet their future water needs by containing their stormwater and cleaning it in a natural way, providing recreation and water for agriculture and people. And they think that they are going to have more water in the future than they would have been if they'd stayed on the hard path. Part of soft path is also to restore the damage done. This is the Tamiami Trail, a part of Tamiami Trail in South Florida. It's now, this part is a bridge. So there was federal funds that were made available to take what used to be ground level road and destroy it and put a bridge, which the purpose of this is to allow the Everglades to flow down to the Everglades National Park and into the southern extreme part of the state. Before, the Tamiami Trail was functioning as a kind of dam and preventing a lot of the water from flowing southward. And a lot of this now also gets into Florida Bay. If you've been in Florida for a long time, you might remember that the Kissimmee River once looked like snakes, which was a good thing, as you'll see in just a second. However, there was a project from Congress, and the Corps of Engineers was told to take this meandering serpentine river system, which flowed from south of Orlando to the top of Lake Okeechobee, and undo all this and make it to just a canal. Why? Well, to dry up the lands on both sides, to open it up for development, farming and housing and so forth. Well, almost as soon as it was built, everybody realized it was a disaster, because one of the advantages of water moving slowly and having to go through all these oxbows and everything is that it helps to purify dirty water. Well, that wasn't happening anymore. And also the water was going south faster than ever before. It was almost like an expressway for dirty water. So you had this tremendous amount of filthy water not being cleaned, hitting Lake Okeechobee and overwhelming it. Well, then what happened was Congress reversed itself, and the Corps of Engineers got a new project, which is to take the canal and try to reshape it to make it look like this again. And this is a sample of what they've been trying to do to restore the hydrologic system. And this restoration is considered one of the most, one of the biggest projects in the world, and maybe one of the most successful. It's just about finished, actually. There's an ongoing restoration effort in the Everglades. The Everglades, as you might remember, is a slow-moving river, and its flow was interrupted for a variety of reasons, and a lot of that water is evacuated east and west, and very little of it's getting down to the south. So there's been a project's been going on for decades and decades, and they're nowhere near finishing it, which is to try to restore the natural flow of the Everglades. And one day it might look like this again. One thing I want to mention before I end this presentation is that you should read this book someday. I didn't write this, but Mr. Stephen Lay did. But it is absolutely amazing. It talks about some new ideas that come from England and Europe, and they've just started to make inroads in this country. I think all of you listening to me understand about our carbon footprint and the need to reduce it. But now we're talking about something called virtual water and our water footprint. So what is that? Well, first of all, you have to look at what blue and green and gray water are. Blue water is water in a lake, green water is water stored in a tree, gray water is water that's either polluted or fresh water that's used to clean up pollution. The idea is when a factory comes into your town and the Economic Development Council says, oh, it's going to create 100 jobs, it's great, let's give them lots of incentives. Well, if you're in the next public meeting, you might say, well, what is the cost of water? Not just the cost of electricity or the cost of the road to help them get on I-75 or something. What about our precious water? What is the total amount of water needed for what these people want when you add the blue, the green, and the gray? For example, if I were to ask you how much water is required to make a cup of coffee, you'd say, well, a cup of water, that's easy, right? No, the answer is really, if you look at the production of a cup of coffee, for agriculture, cleaning the coffee beans, and a host of other things, it's 37 gallons of water, according to economists. This book will show you hundreds of products and how much water is used to make them. So here's just a sample. In Florida, to produce 2 pounds of sugar cane, which is grown a lot in the state, it takes 475 gallons of water just for 2 pounds of raw sugar cane. Now, the estimates for this do vary, but one of the high estimates to produce a cell phone is that it's over 3,000 gallons of water to produce this. And of course, a lot of water is going to be needed to produce the electricity that this phone will use as well. Here is our grandson, Liam, and I used him as a model because his parents had to make a decision, like a lot of young parents. What do you do with your baby when it comes time to get diapers? Do you get disposable diapers or cotton diapers? What's better for the environment? Well, if you're looking at water, it's confusing at first because actually less water is used to produce the disposable diaper. But over the long run, the water footprint, it's better to use this one because the water footprint for one cloth diaper is 4 gallons because it's reusable at least 50 times. This is such a big deal that a lot of countries in the world, when they make their import and export decisions, are taking water cost into consideration. In the Mideast, for example, one of the very arid countries might decide it doesn't make sense to use irrigated water, their own precious local water to grow lime. Might be better to import it from Florida or someplace. And even though you might pay more for the imported limes, you could use the water that you have locally for another more efficient economic purpose. And also, I don't know if you ever thought of it, but the oranges and limes and so forth that leave the state of Florida are carrying Florida water inside them just as much as any plastic water bottle is. And it leaves the state forever. So we can't just rely on engineering, the hard approach anymore. Increasingly, what I've learned is this new enlightened approach means that we have to also look at the sociology aspects of water consumption, the cultural aspects, and a host of other social science perspectives, and including philosophy, which means thinking ethically about water. How much do we owe to future generations to give them not just an unspoiled planet, but also water to meet their basic needs? One place that's putting it all together is Florida Gulf Coast University. They have a brand new water school. Young graduates now can get a bachelor's degree and I think a master's in water engineering, and they don't just look at it in the hard path way, and they have a more comprehensive way of assessing water management. It takes into consideration economics, ethics, the various sciences and so forth, and puts it all together in one big overall view of water management. So it's something new and something encouraging. I'm going to speed through the end right here. I'm just seconds away from finishing. But so how do we solve these problems without any explanation? I'm just going to put a quick list here of what scientists told me they think needs to be done. We need more soft path policies. We need to mandate that all the 4,000 water treatment facilities in Florida use the most advanced method. Only a fraction of them use what is called the tertiary, the third level. We need to take a look at water permitting. The water management districts will give you a permit to pump water if you own the land. And they give away water permits almost like the library cards. So in fact, some people think in Central Florida, it's such a critical situation that we need to stop all new groundwater withdrawals altogether. We should have mandatory septic tank inspections. All water extraction should be metered. As it is now, if people have a well out in the county or even in the municipality, that private well is not metered and people can just pump away like crazy and not pay for it and have no limits on what they want to use. We should meter all water extraction and everybody should have to pay something for the water they use. We need to curb outdoor use of fresh water on lawns. We can use some of that recycled water. And in landscaping, we need to restore our springs and rivers and hydrologic systems. One of the biggest complaints I heard from riverkeeper individuals is that the DEP doesn't hold polluters responsible to the degree they should be held. We need to get real about climate change. Florida is one of the biggest, the government is one of the leaders in denial. And not only recently have I been hearing state legislators talk about climate change. And then what they mainly are talking about is resiliency and mitigation. And the cynical part of me says, of course, that's where the money is going to be to build roads and seawalls and so forth. Of course, they want to get in on that. Almost no talk about cutting carbon emissions. However, we have a whole host of religious groups, private groups, NGOs, state agencies who are kind of working quietly to find out about climate change. But in terms of the state leadership at the state government level, we have a long way to go. A lot of South Florida municipalities have formed coalitions, the city governments have, because they know how dangerous their future is. We need to stop using taxpayers' money to solicit more residents. We need to bring back state supervised growth management. I won't mention Rick Scott's name, but he was the governor that was responsible for destroying what we had before, which was a statewide growth management program to slow down and evaluate and make sure that new growth was done in a smart way. Now it's virtually, it's all gone. It's all left to the local communities to do whatever they want. That governor also cut 3/4 of $1 billion from the water management districts and from the DEP. So a lot of damage was done. Of course, his government will say the recession was underway and they had to take drastic measures to sort of stimulate the economy. But still, in terms of our natural world, we took a real blow during those years. We need to force state legislatures to implement the Florida Water and Land Conservation Initiative. 75% of the voters of Florida approved this, which was to use state funds to buy new lands to serve as recharge areas for water or water restoration or water recharge areas. But the state government, the legislators have tried all kinds of ways to not comply with wish of the voters. And so I think I'll skip this part. And the most important thing, of course, is all the problems. They're political problems. We all have to get along and figure out how to do it wisely. So we need to find politicians who understand the water issues and get them elected. And we have had governors in the past. I'll mention Bob Graham, a Democrat, and Ruben Askew, a Republican. Both those governors decades and decades ago led the state and helped come up with some of the best environmental laws in the country. Actually, a lot of people used to look to Florida for leadership. And that sort of stopped a few decades ago. So we've had people before us that have fought these battles, and by their example, well, we know what can be done and what we need to do. So for all those reasons, I think we got work ahead of us, but I think it can be done. And I hope my book will serve as a primer for people who want to understand the issue and maybe know how to have a few ideas to get them revved up and get to work and try to join those that are fighting these battles. So I'm going to conclude with that. I want to thank the Audubon Society of the Venice area for inviting me, and for any other groups that are watching. If you want to go to my web site there, and you can find my email and shoot me a email. I'll be glad to answer it and converse with you and help you any way I can.